All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 21st Annual Ecological Integration Symposium. Our next speaker is Dr. Jill Barron. Dr. Jill Barron is a senior scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey and a senior research ecologist with the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at Colorado State University. She is the founder and co-director of the John Wellesley Powell Center for Earth System Science and Science Analysis and Synthesis. Dr. Barron is the North American director of the International Nitrogen Initiative and was president of the Ecological Society of America in 2014. She is the founder and principal investigator of the Lockville Watershed Long-Term Monitoring and Research Program in Rocky Mountain National Park that addresses watershed-scale ecosystem processes with continuous records since 1982. She has worked in the fields of biochemical nitrogen cycling and the interactions between society and the environment. Dr. Barron is well known for her studies of atmospheric nitrogen deposition in the Rocky Mountains and informing policymakers on the changing nature of the Rocky Mountains with her testimony to Congress on the Western acid rain and climate change issues. She is also known to be an advocate for women in science, highlighted by her 2015 Woman of Vision Award. Aside from her talents and advocacies, Dr. Barron is also a prestigious author of several papers about biochemistry and ecosystem ecology. Today, Dr. Barron is going to present nitrogen as a global change driver, scaling from small mountain lakes to the globe.
Thank you, Samantha. That was a wonderful introduction. Can you all hear me just fine?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I am honored to be invited as a speaker today for your symposium. I'm sorry it's virtual. I've always wanted to visit College Station and never had, so I was excited, but I'll have to visit you some other time in person. But still, it's great to be here. I am going to talk to you about nitrogen. Of course, everything I do is about nitrogen. And I'm coming at it from the perspective of an ecosystem ecologist and a biogeochemist. So ecosystem ecology is the study of systems, basically. It includes organisms and their inorganic drivers and habitats. I tend to follow nitrogen and carbon around. That's what makes me a biogeochemist. I'm not only am I an ecosystem ecologist, but I'm a civil servant, as Samantha said. I work for the U.S. Geological Survey, which is this venerable research arm of the United States government that was established by John Wesley Powell back in the 1870s. It's a profession I chose by choice. I want to be a civil servant because I think it's very important to do great science and put that back to use for the federal or the public good, in this case for protection of national parks and national forests. So what I'm going to do today is start big. That's what ecosystem ecologists do. I'm going to put nitrogen in a global context. Then I'm going to scale it down to some of the research that we do in Lockville Watershed, which is a picture of what you're seeing right here. And then I will try to pull it back out. And I was really pleased to have Samantha mention that we've been trying to apply what we do to policy as well as to resource management, because that's the scope in which I'm going to try to frame this talk. So let me start big. Let me figure out how to. Why is my slide not? There it is. Okay. So here's the take-home messages for the entire talk. So if you want to take a nap after lunch, please go ahead. But excess nitrogen is a critical global change driver. I think it's equal to what we're seeing in terms of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and I will attempt to convince you that that's true. The effects of excess nitrogen are found worldwide, including in small mountain lakes, and I'll come back down to that in a bit. But we can manage it regionally, nationally, and globally through interventions, both management-related interventions, which I tend to think of as smaller, say on a national park scale, but also with policy interventions that take place in collaboration with partners. And I'll talk about regional partners as well as global partners. So I have to start with a quote, and I don't like to have long word slides, but here is one because I thought it was so important. This is a quote that came out of the United Nations Environmental Program Yearbook for 2019, given by a colleague, Mark Sutton, and I'll introduce him a little bit later. But he said, in 2019, he said the UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program 2014 yearbook highlighted the importance of reactive nitrogen in the environment. Its conclusions are alarming. This is not just because of the magnitude and complexity of the problem, but because so little progress has been made reducing it. He went on to say, few of the solutions identified have been scaled up, while the world continues to pump out nitrogen pollution that contributes significantly to declines in air quality, deterioration of terrestrial and aquatic environments, exacerbation of climate change, and depletion of the ozone layer. So you can see that here in a graph from the United States that was produced a few years ago. On your bottom axis, you've got time from 1900 to 2015. And on the y-axis, you've got increases in reactive nitrogen availability, as well as carbon dioxide emissions. And what you can see is that along about 1950, you start to see an increase in the availability of nitrogen fertilizer. This drives most of our global nitrogen reactive nitrogen problem. And I'll come back to that too. But you can also see an increase in nitrogen oxide emissions. Nitrogen oxide emissions come out of electricity power generating plants, they come from industry, and they come from transportation and construction. Anything that causes combustion through an internal combustion engine or lightning as a natural source produces nitrogen oxides. On the bottom in blue is biological crop end fixation. For that, you want to think about soybeans and alfalfa. These have grown steadily as we grow those crops increasingly to feed livestock, to feed humans. And just to show you how this pattern transfers, if you look at carbon dioxide emissions over the same time period, they too began to ramp up about 1950. So this little bar for 1950 is going to show up throughout the talk because it turns out to be very important, not just for the increase in greenhouse gases, gases that have led toward the climate change issues that we face today, but certainly also for nitrogen issues that I'm going to show you, and for a whole lot of other land change and human-caused issues. 1950 has been designated as the origin of the Anthropocene, human-caused environmental change. So keep your eye out for 1950, it's going to show up throughout the talk. So why did this all come about? Well, in about 1950 is when we started to industrialize globally a manufacturing project named after the two people who developed it, Haber and Bosch. And Haber-Bosch industrial process is the way of taking atmospheric nitrogen, which if you think of it as 78% of the atmosphere all around you. We are in a nitrogen atmosphere with a little bit of the other 20% or so of atmospheric gases are made up of carbon dioxide and oxygen and all the other things in there. But by and large, our atmosphere is inorganic N2 gas, which is unavailable for life on Earth. The Haber-Bosch process, which requires fossil fuels to make happen, is an industrial process that allows us to bust up those triple nitrogen bonds that are in the atmosphere and make the nitrogen reactive. In doing so, it spawned the Green Revolution. Yes, there were crop breeding improvements. There was also the advent of a lot of contemporary irrigation, but without cheap synthetic nitrogen available, we would not have had the Green Revolution, nor would we have been able today to feed 7.8 billion people on this earth. And whatever you think about having that many people on the planet, the fact is we have that many people because there's food availability. We've reduced food restrictions and food shortages throughout much of the world. So all in all, if you're just looking at nitrogen and it's good for humanity, it's a good thing. This benefit to humanity is uncounted from the availability of cheap nitrogen synthetic fertilizer. But what's also called the nitrogen challenge is that nitrogen doesn't stay where it's put. And that's the challenge. Nitrogen gets up in many different types of molecular forms before it finally returns back to the atmosphere as inorganic nitrogen gas. And in its many forms, it causes all kinds of environmental and human health damage. So if you have nitrogen oxides, those are precursors to tropospheric ozone. They cause smog and haze. These have tremendous human health effects, especially for people who have lung problems, asthma. Certainly the coronavirus isn't helping with that. This particular picture is Denver on a very bad day. That's nitrogen oxides. Nitrate, especially, and ammonium are a primary contributor to the loss of biodiversity on the planet. And this is a very simple thing. Some plants are more able to take up nitrogen and store it and grow faster. And in many cases, they do so at the expense of others who get shaded out or don't have access to nitrogen. So loss of biodiversity and its consequent loss of ecosystem services is another severe problem that happens when nitrogen escapes into the environment from its intended use. If enough nitrate falls out of the sky or is leached into soils and then is delivered to lakes and streams, you can cause acidification. Nitrate is a strong acid anion similar to sulfate. And sulfur was the real reason that we started thinking about acid rain back in the 70s and 80s, only to realize that it was a combination of sulfate and nitrate to both. So you can get acid lakes, you can get acidification of soils. All of those things are a consequence of nitrogen escaping to the atmosphere. When too much nitrogen flows into rivers and down into coasts, you get something that I suspect you're rather familiar with in Texas. You get dead zones, such as in the Gulf of Mexico. You get eutrophication, you can get harmful algal blooms. This is a very serious and growing threat worldwide as more nitrogen is flushed down rivers and into our coastal areas. It also causes eutrophication of inland water bodies too, and many of our inland waters all over the world are also affected by this. Whoops, going this way. Nitrous oxide, N2O, is a very strong greenhouse gas. It's about 280 times more heat trapping capability than carbon dioxide. So a little of it goes a long way. We're getting an increase in N2O emissions as we try to grow more rice, any kinds of wetland areas where you have soils that are flooded and then drained. These are sources of nitrous oxide to the atmosphere. They can cause climate change. And when nitrous oxide gets up beyond the troposphere and up into the stratosphere, it can contribute to the growth of the ozone hole because it depletes the ozone that, it depletes the layer that protects us from ozone irradiation. Not only that, are all these problems that I've just described, but nitrogen moves easily and ably among all of them, so that you've created almost an opening of Pandora's box when you let nitrogen loose into the atmosphere. And the only time it's ameliorated is if it finally gets back up into the atmosphere as inorganic N2 gas. So this is a problem that's happening all over the world. It's certainly most apparent in areas that are developed, such as Western Europe, North America. You can see the Mississippi River Basin here. And you can see also Asia, India, as well as China specifically. The more warm the colors going up to black, the more nitrogen is being applied to the environment for intended uses, but then leaching out into coasts, into ecosystems, and causing all of the damages that I've just described over there. It's a global scale problem and growing. And partly because people need food and they want food security, and nitrogen fertilizer is inexpensive. So why not put more on your crops, say the farmers, and they're not wrong. It doesn't hurt their yield, but it certainly causes untold environmental damage, as I've just described. So this is a figure you may all have seen many times before, and if so, I apologize. It came out of a paper. Originally, the paper was titled "A Safe Operating Space for Humanity." And the authors of these two papers, I'm only showing you the most recent one, argued that as a species, we are changing global processes to the extent where we may be exceeding the ability of the Earth to compensate. And if so, we may be affecting those capabilities that allow humanity as well as environmental health to proceed as we would like, instead of having harsh and unpleasant environmental surprises. So where the colors are green, we have not exceeded that safe operating space. Where they're yellow, you want to be a little cautious. Where they're red, we have definitely exceeded the Earth's capacity to compensate for the pollution that we're talking about. And nitrogen right here is the one that is most dramatic in all of that. It dwarfs even what you see for climate change so far, as these authors said, as of 2015. Which brings me to small mountain lakes. Give me 1 second. Okay, thank you. This is a picture of Lockville Watershed. It's in Rocky Mountain National Park, and I'm going to take down to this level of scale, which to me is a very personal level and a very approachable level to look at what nitrogen deposition is doing in these particular systems. Let me orient you a little bit. My research is in Colorado in the Rocky Mountains. Lockville Watershed is in Rocky Mountain National Park. It's east facing, it's east of the Continental Divide. You can see a map of it here on the bottom right. It's got, let's see if the cursor works. So it's about 10 square kilometers, not a whole lot big. This is the Continental Divide right here. It's at 14,000 feet elevation, or about 4,000 meters. This is the outlet of the watershed. It's about 3,100 meters, or about 10,200 feet. We have a couple of glaciers in this system. We have Sky Pond, which is an alpine lake, and we have the Loch, which is a subalpine lake. We also have some vegetation, and we have a few other lakes, but we don't study them nearly as much as we study Sky Pond and the Loch. Sky Pond is an alpine lake. It's right below Taylor Rock Glacier, as you can see right here. It does have vegetation, just not very much. And it's about 10,800 feet in elevation. The Loch is our subalpine lake. You can see right here in the cursor, that's that same glacier that I was showing you right here. So the Loch is about 10,400 feet in elevation. It's surrounded by old growth spruce and fir forests. If you were flying in an airplane and you were crossing the Continental Divide, which is this line of little glaciers right here. So these pictures were not taken by me. They were taken by my good friend Gillian Bowser, who actually used to work at Texas A&M. But she was flying over and she took these pictures. And if you were looking, you would see Lockville Watershed right here. You see it comes from the Continental Divide down to the subalpine forest. If you zoom into it a little bit, and we have done these long-term measurements. We instrumented in 1983 after starting to study it a couple years beforehand. If you zoom in, you can see a subalpine lake down here. It looks green, it's sort of hard to see. You can see Sky Pond up here. It looks very much smaller than it actually is. Here's Glass Lake. Here's a tarn right below Andrews Glacier. We have alpine systems and subalpine spruce fir forest. And we have some instrumentation. We have weather stations. We have buckets that capture rain so that we can look at rain chemistry. We're part of a national network of 250 sites all around the nation who measure precipitation chemistry. And we have stream gauges at the outlet. So it's very simple. And simple is helpful because to keep things going for a long time, you want to have simple long-term measurements. Our approach is also pretty simple, but it's as comprehensive as we can make it. We now have 38 years of continuous monitoring of water quality, of precipitation chemistry, hydrology, and a number of other factors that we look at. But we use as many tools as we possibly can on the premise that if you come up with similar answers from different approaches, it gives you confidence in the results that you are then presenting. So paleolimnology, which is going back into the past to look for records, proxies of things that occurred well before we started monitoring, that's a tool we use quite a lot, and I'll present a lot of our paleolimnological data today. But none of those, either paleolimnology or monitoring, allow you to identify cause and effect. For that, you need to identify hypotheses and conduct experiments. So we do field and laboratory experiments, and I'll show you a few of those. We do ecosystem scale modeling. That's done for two reasons. One is to test our understanding of the system and see whether it's working according to what we think it is. Models are nothing more than mathematical equations. The other reason we use models is to ask what if scenarios. What if the temperature warmed 20 degrees? What would that do to our processes? What if nitrogen deposition either increased or decreased? And increasingly, we do a number of spatial comparisons using our little lakes to see how they compare with lakes from all over the world. Our objectives that we set up back in the early 1980s haven't changed. The first was to distinguish natural from human-caused variability. And honestly, back in the early 1980s, we did not know the answer to that question. How much of what we were seeing was due to atmospheric deposition or acid rain or climate change? We didn't know. So we've gotten valuable information over these many, many years about what the naturally variable system is and how that's changing due to drivers that are human caused. The second objective is really the scientific one that has driven us for so many years, to quantify the effects It started out as acid rain, but we didn't actually find acid rain. Instead, we found tremendous amounts of atmospheric deposition coming in. And we also started from the very beginning to identify what we then called climate variability. Our trends these days are inescapable. There's a climate warming trend that we cannot avoid. So it's now climate change, but it started out of climate variability. The third very important objective, and this is coming back to why I'm a civil servant, is to share this knowledge with resource managers in such a way that they can use it in order to make decisions. So we provide the science, they use it to make the decisions. We never tell them what decisions to make, but we try to give them as much information as possible so they can be as informed as possible. Okay, so the first question you want to ask is, well, how much nitrogen deposition is there? This is a map from the National Atmospheric Deposition Program. It shows you from 2012 what the United States looked like in terms of atmospheric nitrogen falling out of the sky as rain or snow. And this is coming from those 250 sites that I mentioned just a bit ago. Every Tuesday, someone goes out and collects a bucket of whatever fell over the week. It gets analyzed by a central laboratory. And from that, you get a surface. You get a picture of nitrogen and other chemical species across the entire United States over time. It's been very interesting to look at how they've changed. But in 2010, total nitrogen, you could see hotspots, which are the warmer colors. You could see you could see Iowa and Illinois and Wisconsin. You see North Carolina. If you look eastern Texas, you can see some areas where you have high atmospheric deposition of nitrogen. Look at the Central Valley of California. So those are areas where they're getting between 14 and 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. You look at Colorado and you go, not so much there. And that's true. Compared with sites that are very agricultural, you are not seeing a tremendous amount of atmospheric deposition. In fact, our value is about 3 compared with these numbers I just gave you, 14 to 20. We get about 3 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And it hasn't changed for the past 20 years, 30 years, actually, since 1990. That's not very much, but then you come back to Lockville Watershed and you look at it, and it is lovely. Isn't it a beautiful place? Yes, thank you very much. But if you look carefully, you see that there's hardly any soil. There's very little vegetation. 8 months of the year is winter. It's winter up there right now. In fact, it's snowing out my door. And when all that snow melts in the spring, all the goodies that are contained within the snowpack whoosh out all at once in a very strongly peaked hydrograph of snowmelt. So you end up with very little nutrients over the entire year. There's very little vegetation or soils to store them. And 3 kilograms per hectare per year, even though it sounds very low, is still an order of magnitude greater than the background value. So it's having a big effect on the ecosystems here. We did a number of studies over many, many years. We looked in soils, we looked in vegetation, both alpine and subalpine. We've looked in lake and street chemistry. And the short answer to where we looked is that everywhere we looked, we found nitrogen had altered these ecosystems. Microbial activity, vegetation composition, forest nutrient chemistry, the foliar chemistry, and especially the lake and stream chemistry. We have much higher nitrate concentrations where nitrogen deposition is high, and it has changed lake algal assemblages and productivity over time. So over time means we have to go back into the paleolimnological records to look at what happened before we started studying in 1983. So we did that. We took lake sediment cores in about the year 2000. So that's 20 years ago. I'm going to show you more recent cores in a little bit. But in 2000, we took 2 types of cores. We took a long core, which took us down 14,000 years to the past, which is when the glacier retreated from Sky Pond. And in that core, we looked at diatoms. So diatoms are algae with single-celled plants. Diatoms specifically have glass cell walls, and those cell walls have etchings specific to the species that they live in. So glass cell walls, when the diatom dies, it falls to the bottom because it's heavy, and they accumulate in the sediments. You can identify them to species, even going back farther than 14,000 years. And diatoms are very specific to the environment they live in, the chemistry and the temperature. So you can infer from diatoms all kinds of things that have gone on over time. And so we did that 20 years ago. Here we were looking at the rate of change of diatom assemblages from when the glaciers retreated 14,000 years up to the present. And in the present in here it was 1920, or about the year 2000. So I want to draw your attention first to what happened when the glaciers retreated. For the first 300 years or so, you see a lot of rate of change. There was a rapid rate of change as diatoms were sort of figuring out this new aquatic environment that they were living in. They were, where'd it go? They were rapidly organizing and reorganizing. And then somewhere around the year 11,000 before present, they settled down into a very typical ultra-oligotrophic assemblages of diatoms. These are diatoms living in very pure, low ionic strength waters with very low nutrients until years 1950. You could see this line right here show, I'm sorry, go back. You can see this line start to increase. And again, you see the rate of change increase exponentially and dramatically. One of the things I want to point out to you, is that the rate of change for the first 11,000 years or so was from 0 to 0.1, whereas the rate of change since then, up until the present, is 0 to 2.5. So our rate of change since 1950, that magical year of the onset of the Anthropocene, is an order of magnitude greater than anything that happened over the past 14,000 years. And today, not only did we see an increase in specific types of diatoms, we also saw an increase in productivity. The diatoms today are 8 to 25 times more abundant than they were before. So what happened in 1950 in Colorado? So there's a number of things that went on. First of all, is that same Haber-Bosch process I mentioned to you before. It made worldwide the availability, a ready availability of nitrogen fertilizer. In Colorado, what that meant was ready access to crops to grow livestock. And we have a very important and productive livestock industry in the state of Colorado. We rank first in the nation for heads of cattle on feed. That translates to giant feedlots. And you can see cattle numbers sort of going up commensurate over time with the increase in nitrogen fertilizer. In the 1950s in Colorado also was the time of great trans-basin diversions of water for irrigation. We have lots of water on the western slope of Colorado and very little on the Great Plains on the east. So giant tunnels were drilled into the Rocky Mountains to provide Colorado River water and other waters to the eastern side. So it was the perfect ingredients for a cattle industry: fertilizer to grow crops, water to grow crops, a nice sunny dry environment, and you can see that our cattle industry has only prospered over time. Also, post-World War II, people realized that this was a nice place to live, and the population along the Colorado Front Range, specifically Denver and Colorado Springs area, started to go up about 1950. So all of these are sources of nitrogen. If you recall back to what's going on, people needed construction, they needed energy, they needed transportation. Cattle need soy and other nitrogen types of things from crops. They also produce a lot of nitrogen in their manure. We also saw big changes, as we were looking at our lakes and streams, we saw big changes in lake and stream chemistry. I mentioned that our eastern side lakes had higher nitrogen than other parts of Colorado where there's much less nitrogen deposition. We looked at that and turned it into a question about resource response ratios. Do the algae care, for instance, whether there's high nitrogen in the water, or do they also need some other nutrients? So over here, you can see a couple of graphs. These are resource response ratios, where we looked at some 80 lakes in Colorado, both where nitrogen deposition was high and where nitrogen deposition was low. And to add to that, we added several hundred lakes in Scandinavia. Those are the red dots from Norway and Sweden. And what we found is that when nitrogen deposition was very low, those are the sites on the western slope of Colorado or in parts of Scandinavia, you added nitrogen to these waters and the algae increased their productivity. They also changed their species composition. If the nitrogen was already high, you could add any amount of nitrogen and there was no response. But there was a huge response if you added phosphorus. So we were able to show the nitrogen deposition alone is enough to trigger a growth spurt and an increase in primary productivity in lakes that had low nitrogen deposition all across the world, especially in our system's Loch Vale. We then turned to experiments. We did mesocosm experiments in lakes that had low nitrogen deposition and lakes that had high, and we found something rather similar. So these are very simple graphs that show you over time in incubation where we have controls, and we had just lake water, and we added phosphorus. And we saw no change. This is chlorophyll over here, which is a proxy for biomass or productivity. We saw no change in these lakes that had low nitrogen deposition to begin with. If you added nitrogen, you get a little bit of increase in productivity. If you add nitrogen and phosphorus, you get a big increase in nitrogen in plant productivity, algal productivity. But what was more interesting to us, and we followed up on that sense, is that if you had no nitrogen available, you had these representative algae of very low nitrogen or very low nutrient availability, chrysophytes. If you added nitrogen or if you added phosphorus, you get an abundance of green algae, which are algae that like nutrients. Diatoms fall somewhere in between. But these were experimental evidence suggesting that a little bit of nutrients go a long way, and a little bit of nitrogen especially can flip your systems from something representative of very low nutrients to something more mesotrophic or nutrient rich. So we had published a number of those studies, and people were not very interested because they couldn't actually see any changes in our lakes and streams. They had to take us on faith. And we were making the argument that these very subtle changes we were seeing in algae were at the beginning of a trajectory of change that could only lead to greater change. And here, come along 2010, we see, surprise, a whole bunch of algae growing visibly all over the bottoms of our lakes. These are pictures taken since 2010 in both Loch Vale, in Valach, our subalpine lake, and Sky Pond, the alpine lake. But we're also finding anecdotal evidence that these kinds of proliferations of green algae are occurring in mountain lakes all over the world right now, including places like Lake Baikal, also lakes in the Sierra Nevada of California, up in the Snowy Range and the Wind Rivers of Wyoming. These are green algae, they're nutrient loving. They include a number of species, Spirogyra, Zygnema, and Nitella. So we started asking ourselves, what's actually going on here? We did not predict this because we assumed these green algae needed phosphorus. And so we went back to the sediment cores to ask a number of big questions. When did benthic algae start to proliferate? For that, we went back in time. And why? Why did they start to proliferate? For that, we turned to experiments in the field and in the laboratory, but I'm going to talk to you about field experiments today. So paleolimnology, again, it's going back in the past, using proxies to place the present in context. We took cores out of the Loch and of Sky Pond. You can see a core on this left-hand panel that we took from the ice in Sky Pond. It's a cylinder of sediment. You extrude it from the bottom up, and you slice on the top increments of sediment in quarter centimeter increments. And from that, you get all kinds of information that can tell you at what time and what kinds of processes took place in the past before we ever started measuring. So once we got those sediments, we processed them. We looked at algal pigments, not just diatoms, although we looked at diatoms too. We used high-performance liquid chromatography, HPLC, in order to look at pigments. We counted and identified the diatom subfossils, as I mentioned before, because they tell us a lot about which species are growing and what their conditions are. We also looked at carbon and nitrogen, both concentrations and their isotopic signatures, and we dated these with a radiometric dating technique called lead-210. So we were able to see when in the core we were seeing different types of changes going on. So the pigments are kind of new. Back in 2000, when we took our first sets of cores, this was a technique that was just being developed. And they allow a much larger body of information to be taken biologically, to be inferred biologically about what's going on in the cores. So the diatoms give off their own special pigment. This particular diatom keeps showing up because it's a Sterionella formosa. This is the dominant diatom now. It covers 40% of all the diatom species that we see, whereas it used to be 1%. We also get pigments for green algae. Those are the ones I just showed you that you can see visibly in the bottoms of the lakes. Cyanobacteria is an endpoint that we don't want to go to in mountain lakes. That would be unthinkable, where you'd have a proliferation of blue-green algae that produce toxins. Now, not all cyanobacteria do that, but we would hope that our cyanobacteria are either non-nitrogen fixers and not competitive or toxin producers. The other pigments you get are chrysophytes. These are the very ultra-oligotrophic types of species that live in nutrient-poor waters. And there's one more sort of comprehensive pigment that gives you total community biomass over time. So we processed all of these, and what we found was something very interesting. It wasn't that we had missed this proliferation of green algae when we first saw it in 2010, but it had started a lot earlier. So there's a red line running down there, and when I release the black boxes, you will see that it goes to 1950. But what it shows is that all algae started to increase in numbers and biomass about 1950. These two lines correspond, one each for Sky Pond and for the loch. It started to increase about 1950, along with when the diatoms shifted their productivity. But it's being driven by green algae. These are pigments that are representative of the green algae going on. It's not representative of the other kinds of algae. And in fact, diatoms are seeming to be, I won't say replaced, but they're certainly being overtaken by this proliferation of chlorophytes coming in. What we did see with the diatoms replicates what we saw from the earlier sediment cores, which is, first of all, Asterianella formosa, which is this lovely diatom here, became prominent post-1950. We saw that before 20 years ago when we took a core. But what we hadn't seen before is that it basically says the diatoms took to the water column. Before that, diatoms were predominant in the benthos. They live on rocks. They form that slippery substance you sometimes feel when you try to cross a stream with shoes on. And now, since 1950, our diatoms are dominated by planktonic species. So it's an indication that there's been a change going on, probably related to the availability of nitrogen in the water. But in any case, the chlorophytes have now taken over the benthos. They're living on the lake bottoms, and the algae are living in the water column themselves. So when did algae start to proliferate? Started about 1950. The growth, however, is continuing and accelerating. So that's very interesting. It wasn't a one-time change. We are continuing to see a proliferation, an increase in biomass, and especially since 2000, when we started to see it and other people started to see it around the world as well. We went back to the field. We did experiments. We also did laboratory experiments, which I'm not going to describe today. But in the field experiments, we wanted to ask specific questions about nitrogen and phosphorus and whether nutrients had something to do with the types of species that we were seeing. Our laboratory experiments, which I won't describe today, added temperature. So we can manipulate temperature and see whether that also had an effect. And the short answer is yes, but I want to talk to you about the field experiments. We did what are called nutrient diffusion substrate experiments, and you can see them in the field. We set them on a rock in Sky Pond. We left them there for 2 years. These are little film canisters filled with agar, where we augmented some with nothing. Those are the controls. We added nitrogen to others. We added phosphorus to others, and then we added both nitrogen and phosphorus. And as I said, we left them there for a couple of weeks. We came back and looked at what was growing, how much, and what they responded to. So this is almost a no-brainer. Algae like nutrients. When you add nitrogen and phosphorus, which is our purple bar on the right, you got a big growth in all productivity. So primary productivity, chlorophyll A, shows that nitrogen and phosphorus together gave you the greatest response. Interestingly, in Sky Pond, where water quality, our nitrate concentration, ambient concentration, is about 1.5 milligrams of nitrogen per liter, we added nitrogen, it didn't matter. We added phosphorus, it really didn't matter. If anything, it might have depressed a little bit of chlorophyll. But the only thing that really caused a big growth spurt in all the algae was this phosphorus and nitrogen amendment, both of them coming out together. If you look at the green algae alone, you see the same phenomenon. Here it looks like a little bit of response to nitrogen, no response at all in the control or the phosphorus, but a huge response when you added phosphorus and nitrogen alone. Interestingly, we saw the opposite pattern for diatoms. So diatoms did best in the control when there was no nutrients added at all. It was depressed almost when you added nitrogen, phosphorus, or both. So they seem to be doing well in the ambient conditions they have, but as more nutrients, including phosphorus, appear, and also nitrogen, we're likely to see perhaps a restructuring even more than we already have, where green algae come to dominate and diatoms are much less important. So again, these are diatoms growing on the substrates. They're not water column diatoms at all, but they are less responsive to nutrients than the green algae coming in. So to summarize what's going on locally, it looks like productivity began to increase about 1950. It's continuing to accelerate. Nitrogen and also phosphorus and warming, which I'm not talking to you about today, interact to stimulate this green algae. And we're seeing what looks like a fundamental shift from oligotrophic lake systems to those that are eutrophic, much more productive, visibly green than we've ever seen before. And this is in a national park. This is in an area that is classified as class 1 clean air area. So this is an area where air pollution is restricted by law from harming natural ecosystems over time. So how is all of the information I've presented to you useful? The total body of published evidence, and I've presented to you some of the lake data, but also the data we collected on alpine vegetation, forest health, soil microbial activity, they provide a huge body of evidence that there's change going on in these ecosystems, and that change is due to atmospheric nitrogen deposition. It's now augmented, as I mentioned before, by temperature and phosphorus, but nitrogen is something that we can control. So we published a large number of papers over the year, more than 80 at this time, and we've given a very large number of talks. We've made a very convincing argument to non-governmental organizations, to the National Park Service, to regulatory agencies, to the public. We've made a very convincing argument that nitrogen deposition was changing in Rocky Mountain National Park. So some of these non-governmental organizations said, that's change, but that's also damage. Specifically, Trout Unlimited and the Environmental Defense Fund mounted a campaign. They went to the Department of Interior, which is where the National Park Service resides, and they said, you, National Park Service, are coming afoul of the law. You're required by law to protect these ecosystems from air pollution, and this nitrogen constitutes air pollution. Now, the Park Service is not a regulatory agency, so they went to the regulatory agencies that could help them, and all of them agreed to try to manage nitrogen in a way that they could in order to protect Rocky Mountain National Park. So out of that came this very unwieldy agreement, a memorandum of understanding. This was signed in 2007. It's called the Rocky Mountain National Park Initiative Nitrogen Deposition Reduction Contingency Plan. And it's a memorandum between these agencies, the state of Colorado, EPA, and the National Park Service, to use policy and voluntary measures to try to reduce nitrogen deposition from its current level, which is 3 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. They want to cut it in half, down to 1.5 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, which is the critical load below which the ecological effects that we've observed should not occur. That 1.5 value is half of what it is today, and they set a glide path that said, okay, starting in 2007, it's at 3. We would like to achieve a value of 1.5 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year by the year 2032. So we're midway through this process right now. Excuse me. So I haven't told you where the nitrogen is actually coming from. Let me back up and do that. If you are still in your airplane and you're flying from west to east here, so you're looking south along the Colorado Front Range, here's Rocky Mountain National Park. Here is our very affluent and very developed and very successful urban and agricultural corridor along the Colorado Front Range. You've got Denver, you've got Fort Collins, you've got Boulder, you've got Greeley. You have some of the most productive agricultural lands in the country, as I mentioned before. We have successful industry. We have a tremendous amount of unconventional oil and gas. We have huge amounts of transportation going back and forth. All of those things collect nitrogen oxide and ammonia. They pull them up into the atmosphere, especially during the springtime, like now, when we get upslope storms. These are weather events that move against the prevailing jet stream winds. They entrain pollution from the Colorado Front Range. They move it up into the atmosphere where it hits the tropospheric boundary layer and boom, falls into Rocky Mountain National Park. So we are, by and large, the source of our own pollution. We're not the only source. We've actually done back trajectories that trace back to the panhandle of Texas, back to Juarez and Monterey, Mexico. We see other sources, but about 80 to 90% of our own pollution is us. We are soiling our own nest. So that's good news because that means we can control it locally, unlike many other states where they have a lot of transboundary air pollution that is beyond state control. So how are we trying to do this? I want to show you several lines on this graph. The top one is the black line. That's the total inorganic nitrogen that's coming out of the sky that we measure in our buckets in Lockville watershed. It's made up of nitrate and ammonia. And as I've mentioned a couple of times before, since 1990 to 2017, 20 today, it hasn't changed. Nitrogen deposition has been holding steady at about 3 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. Yeah, there's wet years and dry years, but it's been holding pretty steady. If you look at the red line or brick colored line there, that's nitrate. And you could see that that's actually declining rather steadily over time, which is great news. We had nothing to do with that. The policy had nothing to do with that. That's a matter of economic forces as Colorado has started to transition towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. Also, as our fleet has gotten cleaner and we have far less nitrogen oxides coming out of tailpipes of transportation vehicles. So without us doing anything, nitrogen oxide emissions are going down and should continue to decline if we are allowed to continue this transition toward clean energy and cleaner vehicles. The bottom line, that's blue, that's going the opposite direction. That's ammonium, and it's increasing to this day, so that ammonium is now the dominant inorganic nitrogen that's falling out of the sky as rain and snow in Lockville. Well, ammonium has an agricultural source, by and large. There's other small sources that produce it, but it comes basically from livestock. And I have mentioned that we have livestock. Eastern Colorado is home to one of the most economically valuable livestock regions in the United States. We have giant feedlots, as you see right here. We're up to 1 million head of cattle, or many hundreds of thousands of head of cattle are confined at any one time. All of these animals, of course, are producing manure. It's especially urine patches that cause ammonia to volatilize up and get into the atmosphere. We have livestock that's produced for beef. We also have sheep. We're number one in the nation for sheep on feed, but we also have an increasing number of dairies that produce, again, manure, and all of that is producing ammonia coming up into the atmosphere. So it's created a very strong and interesting coalition of strange partners. And if you look at who is part of this agricultural subcommittee, who's now tasked with developing voluntary measures and best management practices to reduce nitrogen emissions, it gives you pause. This is a very interesting group. We've been together since 2007. Yes, you can see EPA's logo here, and you can see the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Here's the Park Service. But look, here's the wheat growers. Here's the pork producers, the dairy farmers, the Livestock Association. So these are a group of people who meet quarterly. We all get together in person when we can, quarterly, to talk about what best management practices are working and which are not. These people come together voluntarily for a couple of reasons. First, they don't want to be regulated. They don't know what regulation for agricultural ammonia emissions would look like, and that would be, I'm sure that would be more expensive than what they're doing now. Excuse me. But second of all, they're all Coloradans, and they don't want to harm Rocky Mountain National Park any more than anybody else does. So there's a couple of reasons why we come together. There's a number of things that are actually working, which is very interesting. If you do adjustments to the intake of feed so that the right proteins are being fed to your livestock, you can actually reduce the amount of nitrogen in manure and urine by up to 10%, which is a huge reduction. So that's something that's going to be adopted more and more over time. We also have an early warning system, which is a computer model. It's using WRF, if you're familiar with that. It's a weather model that shows when there will be upslope storm events that would move pollution from the farmers and the farm regions up to Rocky Mountain National Park. On those days, those who participate get a text message on their phones that say, here comes an upslope event for the next 3 days. Please employ your absolute best management practices over these next 3 days. Don't move your sewage, don't spread your manure, and wait until the winds blow toward Kansas before you start to do it. It's not a solution, but it may be a solution for Rocky Mountain National Park in the short term to prevent pollution moving up into the park and continuing to affect our ecosystems over there. So the long-term research that we did in Loch Vale discovered a pollutant, nitrogen, that has changed every part of our alpine and subalpine ecosystems in Rocky Mountain National Park. This body of evidence was convincing and led to the establishment by regulatory agencies as well as land resource managers to develop this policy designed to reduce emissions that cause deposition of nitrogen. We're about halfway into it. I did not show you those responses. What we've seen is that nitrogen deposition is not coming down overall, and that's because of the ammonium that we see. But we do see that it's not increasing. So it's giving us some level of encouragement that we might be able to continue working this way voluntarily without trying to do something more forceful in terms of regulations. But it comes about, and I will try to make this point when I move into an international scale. It comes about by making personal relationships with the people who actually have to make a change. So the policy came about, but it's patience and trust and building partnerships with stakeholders, taking them on field trips, as you can see right here. That's how we in the United States, I think, are going to be able to work toward these complicated solutions that involve nitrogen, because we don't want to reduce anybody's way of making a living. We don't want to change people's ways of life, but yet we have to protect the natural resources that are so special in this particular country. So let me move from this small example that we found in Rocky Mountain National Park and take it out to, I'm going to skip national and go up directly to international management implications. Again, we have this nitrogen challenge where nitrogen is a good thing. It's feeding the world. So we need to optimize that nitrogen use in food and energy production. Well, optimizing energy production means reducing it so that we produce no nitrogen from energy production and transportation. But we also want to minimize the consequent harm to humans and the environment. That is the slogan that defines the International Nitrogen Initiative. The picture here is of Jim Galloway, who's at the University of Virginia. He's the godfather of all of this policy development that's gone on nationally, internationally over the past 30 years related to nitrogen management. And they go on, I goes on to say further, nitrogen is a solution. Of course it is, it feeds the world, but it should not be a problem. That spawned a big international program called Towards the International Nitrogen Management System. And this is a program I'm heavily involved in today. It works at an international level, specifically at the United Nations level. It was funded for a 4-year effort through the Global Environmental Federation, which is part of the United Nations Environmental Program. And what it's trying to do on an international scale is what we tried to do in Rocky Mountain National Park. It's bringing the scientific evidence together to inform policies and the public on all the multiple benefits and threats of reactive nitrogen. So the picture here is of Mark Sutton. He's the mastermind behind this, taking his cue from Jim Galloway. And this person is a dead ringer for Harry Potter, as you can see, but he's also a genius in working at this international level of trying to tell people that there's good related to nitrogen, but we have to manage all the damage that's being caused. And the damage, well, the program that got developed. We're 3 years into a 4-year effort. Has 4 components, and I am not going to go into each one of these because it took a 900-page proposal to get it funded. There's at least 900 pages of documentary pages right now, but it's broken into different ways of providing science to an international and national audience. The first is tools and methods for understanding the nitrogen cycle at different levels. The second is using a whole series of different models to quantify nitrogen use, flows, impacts, benefits, and practices. They're using the year 2000 as a base year. They're going up to 2050, looking at scenarios of what would happen if different practices were imposed. There's a whole set of regional demonstrations. All of them are international that are looking at how nitrogen is managed across borders. We have one in North America between Canada and the US. And then this fourth one is information sharing, awareness raising and knowledge sharing at this time with the United Nations organizations that have a way of, that could have a way in managing nitrogen. So let me just remind you what's at stake here. This is how nitrogen is influencing the environment. We've got smog and haze that influence environment and human health. We have loss of biodiversity, acidification. You've got eutrophication and intense dead zones in most coastal areas across the developed world and increasingly in the developing world. You've got precursors that cause climate change. You even have nitrogen species that affect the ozone hole. This is a dangerous place to be where nitrogen is so harmful. It also turns out to be the sweet spot where the United Nations frameworks come into play. So nitrogen, I want to point you first to the bottom of this circle. You can see INMS, its little logo. We are providing support. There is no convention for nitrogen management, and we don't think there should be. But we do see that nitrogen management interacts with a great number of other international conventions and frameworks. So going up to the top, I want to point out to you climate. This is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. You're familiar with that because that's a way that the nations around the world set climate carbon dioxide emission standards. If you move to the right, you see the Montreal Protocol for measuring stratospheric ozone and chlorofluorocarbons and now nitrous oxide. You see that there's a place for nitrogen to manage in biodiversity with the Convention on Biodiversity, Biological Diversity. Land use change, climate, yes, these are very important reasons why biodiversity is diminishing, invasive species, but nitrogen is right up there among the top 3 or 4 major causes of loss of biodiversity. In the marine world, you have the Global Protection Act, which looks at marine and coastal protection, again, from water pollution, from overfishing, from a number of things. And marine systems, as you well know from the Gulf of Mexico, are being severely impacted by nitrogen. And then in the top left, around between 10 and 11 o'clock, you have the Long-Range Transport of Air Pollution Convention that manages air transport of pollutants across boundaries. So nitrogen can intervene here in every one of those. And we have begun, I should say Mark Sutton and his colleagues have begun to interact with each and every one of these in order to try to get language inserted whereby governments can start to manage within their nations and across nations in order to protect ecosystems in a way that is better than we have before. So some of that is beginning. I'm very excited. In October of this past year, there was an international UN Environment Program meeting in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And they came out with a manifesto, a Colombo Declaration, that calls specifically for tackling global nitrogen challenge. So it wasn't just arm wavy, like a lot of what I've been doing about how nitrogen is causing all these effects. It was saying, we have a goal, and we're actually going to try to cut nitrogen waste, that's all the pollution that isn't going into food production, to cut nitrogen waste by half by the year 2030. So this is very exciting. It's a very ambitious goal. Is it possible? I don't know, but it's something we need to start working at. And just coincidentally, it's the same goal that we had in Colorado for reducing our nitrogen deposition in half by the year 2032. So about the same over time. It's something that we're all going to try to be working for. There are many ways that each and every one of us can reduce our own nitrogen budget or footprint. And it's something that I think we all need to be working for. So what I've tried to give you in this talk is an idea of how our example in Rocky Mountain National Park in Loch Vale is contributing information to the kinds of data that will be used at national, regional, national, and international scales. Our lakes are only one example of hundreds of those kinds of examples of how nitrogen impacts ecosystems all over the world. And as we build this global scale body of evidence, we are to the point where we should now be thinking about how we manage it better. It does need more study, we're always being surprised, but it's to the point where management can really be made important. And we don't need more research, I think, in order to come to that conclusion. So with that, I want to thank you. I'm open for all kinds of questions, and I turn it back over to Samantha.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was wonderful. If anyone has any questions, you can either unmute your microphone and ask, or you can put it up in the chat and I can read the question for you. Jonna asked, she said, great talk, Dr. Barron. What do you think are the barriers for the policymakers to take actions? What is the most effective way to communicate and engage the public about climate change?
Oh, two great questions. I think we live in a very interesting political climate now, and it's been that way for decades, where regulation is almost a dirty word. No farmers and no sources of polluters want to be told that they have to do something that will cost them money for perhaps benefits that they don't directly see. So policymakers, I think, need to adopt more of this collaborative approach that we're doing in Colorado, where they work with stakeholders in order to convince them of the benefit of what they're trying to do. A lot of this comes, I think, also about better environmental literacy, knowing that what we used to call externalities, which are the things you don't have to pay for if you want a good out of something, if you want to produce something, those externalities are not externalities. They actually have real strong human health, environmental impacts. They have economic impacts. And so making everyone who has a decision in emissions more aware of what's actually happening when they try not to get, when they emit pollutants to the atmosphere, I think that will go a long way toward making things better. Policymakers in the United States have become very good at developing collaborative approaches, at least up until very recently. And so your second part of the question was about communication, and I think some of it is presenting this information in a holistic enough way that they see that there's more than one side to every argument. I don't know if you've all seen the bumper sticker, I'm sure you have, that says, away? There is no away. So when you produce nitrogen as a byproduct, if it leaches out of your cornfields and down into and affects surface water chemistry, that doesn't matter to the farmer necessarily, but it will matter to the people downstream whose drinking water supplies are compromised, or it will matter to the shellfish industries in the Gulf of Mexico. So we need to have more comprehensive types of ways of communicating to our audiences, any audiences, about all of the effects that happen when something is tweaked in the environment. And I think you can do that with stories and pictures and ways that they can relate directly to it. One of the ways we were so successful in Colorado was by taking them on field trips to Loch Vale Watershed. They love this place. They go up there, we're hiking around, I'm showing them where we do research and what the effects are, and they're going, I get it. What we do down on the Front Range, whether it's driving my car or eating a hamburger, that influences Rocky Mountain National Park. That makes them think twice the next time that they're thinking about whatever actions they're taking that cause a pollutant. So that was a long-winded way of answering your two questions. I hope I did.
We have a question asking, I am in Monterrey or Monterrey, Mexico. Sorry for mispronouncing that. What are your recommendations to control nitrogen emissions?
So my ignorance is going to show. I believe in Monterey, we were seeing oil and gas emissions. Is that true?
I'm waiting for a response.
Yep. Yes. No.
We can always come back to this question.
Okay. I think, so there's ways that personally you can reduce nitrogen emissions. Excuse me. You can use less fossil fuel driven transportation. So public transport is a great thing to do. Buses, trains, bicycle travel, if it's at all possible, is a wonderful way of getting out of your car. So that's an important personal way you can reduce your nitrogen emissions specifically from transportation. The most important thing personally you can do is to change your diet. And I suspect you've seen lots of talks recently about how that also helps with greenhouse gases. These cows, these really lovely animals over here in the bottom left, not only emit a ton of methane, which is a greenhouse gas, but it takes tons and tons of nitrogen. My numbers are wrong. It takes an awful lot of nitrogen to produce beef. And if you were to move toward a more plant-based diet, you could actually have a huge impact, if everybody did, on the planet in terms of nitrogen ammonia emissions, as well as nitrate that's leaching into ground and surface waters. That doesn't mean you have to become vegan or vegetarian, just means you have to reduce your meat intake. And it would, even 1 day a week would go a long way toward reducing nitrogen. Industrially, there are caps you can put on, there are caps that industries can put on their smokestacks to reduce the nitrogen oxide emissions. Ultimately, you would want to get toward renewable energies, so you're not combusting and producing energy in ways that produce nitrogen oxides overall. You could also argue for policies that lead toward more precision farming and less abundant applications of fertilizers to agricultural crops. And there are ways that different organizations can help do that, showing the right time to apply the right fertilizer instead of putting on more fertilizer than is necessary. So I will quit there with those kinds of answers.
Yeah, he added that the last days they've had heavy pollution in the town. So I think you did touch on that. Another question was what kinds of efforts exist to capture the nitrogen in livestock manure to use the manure as fertilizer?
Oh, this is a wonderful question, and something we're working on very actively in our demonstration project for North America, which is taking place in a very small watershed, by the way, up in Washington State and southern British Columbia. It's a dairy farming region, and a lot more manure is produced than they can actually spread on their fields. So in many parts of the world, in many parts of the United States at least, cattle are eating food that's imported from outside their watershed. So they excrete some 60% of that, or maybe even more, as manure. And the best ways to get rid of that is actually to spread it and use it as fertilizer on fields. But if it's too much to add to fields in the area where you are, there is a whole effort now to try to describe what's called manure sheds, like air sheds. Only manure sheds are where you could reasonably transport manure in order to spread it as fertilizer on somebody else's field. And so there's an attempt to try to do that. You can also dry it. You could dry it down and use it as fuel in digesters. I have spent quite a bit of time over the years in Mongolia, which is a country that has very few trees, but an awful lot of livestock. And their manure is the fuel. They actually collect dung and they use it to heat their homes and to cook their food. So it's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. You could do that on a large industrial scale. In the region that we're working in the Pacific Northwest, and that's where these lovely cows are, the region is small enough that they actually capture the manure in giant tanks, and they're beginning to develop slurry pipelines that take that slurry to places where they have digesters. and they're burning it as fuel. They're also capturing the methane that comes off of it. They're burning that as fuel, and they're capturing the nitrogen and phosphorus that are byproducts of that and using it again as fertilizer. So there's a lot of ways you can deal with a manure. The problem is it's heavy, and you can't really transport it across the country nearly as readily as you can transport feed.
Okay, another question is, Dr. Reed highlighted the fact that nitrogen fertilizers, especially nitrates, have a tendency to leach from the ground after rainfalls. Do you have any recommendations on application regimes to minimize loss?
This is the most important problem that I think we're dealing with worldwide, is that fertilizer, only about 50% of any nitrogen that's applied actually gets taken up by plants. So no matter how precise you are, and precision farming is certainly better than not, adding only the right amount at the right time for the roots to take it up, we're still going to have a leaching problem. So you could try to minimize that, and you can, again, I'll use the word precision farming, right time, right place, right amount, right formulas are what the fertilizer industry advocates. The other thing we can try to do, and there are groups all over the world that are trying to develop better plant breeding techniques, the Land Institute is one of them, to either develop perennial crops, such as a perennial wheat or a perennial corn, where you wouldn't have to add so much fertilizer because it's an annual plant each year. And the other thing would be to enhance the nitrogen fixing capabilities of plants that are not leguminous right now. So I don't know how far along they are in those plant breeding capabilities, but that would go a long way toward trying to reduce the nitrate that leaches out from agricultural crops when it's applied.
Does anyone else have any more questions? Oh, we just got another one. Can a farmer or rancher do this on a small scale and use the excess fertilizer for fuel?
I am not sure I know the answer to that question. I don't know why not, but I don't know actually how you would develop, you know, in a sense, it might be like retrofitting a car to use biodiesel instead of diesel. But I don't know the answer to that. It's a funny thing, because I spend an awful lot of my life right now thinking about manure and fertilizer, when in fact my real research is up in those beautiful pristine lakes up there on the top. So I'm not an expert on that, but I think you could. I do know of some larger operations, dairy operations in California, where they are using manure as their fuel.
All right, well, we're waiting for any more questions to come in. I'm going to just plug in the Lunch and Learn tomorrow. So apologies if you've heard this for the 17th time. If you have any questions for Dr. Barron or any of the other plenary speakers that we've had today, we do have an interactive, informal lunch tomorrow that you have to pre-register for. So you can do this on our virtual symposia page, and you can fill out that form link. You'll receive an email with the Zoom link and a password. You won't have access to this if you don't fill out that link, so make sure you do that today so you can get that email tonight. And we'll give it a couple more minutes if anyone has any other burning questions. Otherwise, you can join us tomorrow at lunch and ask. Several of the question askers said thank you.
Thank you. You guys have been a great audience. It's a little awkward doing this remotely, and I hope we all get past this safely and healthy.
Yes, for sure.